Disclaimer: the contents of Studio 151 podcast and the TU Communication Disorders Connection podcast do not represent the views and beliefs of the University of Tulsa and the Mary Kay Chapman Center.
Hello, welcome back to the 6th episode of the TU Communication Disorders Connection podcast. This is Chloe McEachern, and today we have two special guests joining us as we continue to explore the Big Nine area of social pragmatic language. Our first guest is Dayli Walker, a first-year graduate student at the University of Tulsa. Our second guest is Hanna. Catherine is a mother of one of our special clients at the Mary Kay Chapman Center. We are thrilled to have you both here today. I'm going to hand it over to Dayli to get us started.
I'm so excited to have the opportunity today to talk to Catherine about her family's journey through obtaining a diagnosis and services for their daughter. Catherine, can you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your family?
Hi, my name is Hanna. My husband and I have 3 girls, ages 7, 5, and 8 months. Our oldest has been coming to the Mary Kay Chapman Center for services for the past 5.5 years. And over that time, we've worked with many different therapists as we've come and gone through the semesters and as the girls have sort of worked through the programs. And we've seen a lot of progress with our oldest child in that time.
Can you explain a little more about what led you to seek that diagnosis in the beginning?
We saw some things as she was starting to get a little bit older and developing where she was a bit delayed on some of her milestones, but at the same time, some of her milestones were on time. So she did say her first word, mama, at 6 months, which, is expected. But we also did not see her consistently responding to her name at the same time. She was very social and interactive. As a baby, she wanted to connect with people. She enjoyed meeting new people and experiencing new things. But at the same time, we could see some symptoms of sensory differences where when she would get very upset, the way that we would calm her down is to take her outside, even as a baby. And I would just point out, of course, because Oklahoma is very windy, the trees would be moving. Mm-hmm. And I would tell her, look at the trees. And she'd feel the wind and be able to see nature and the sun and feel the warmth and sort of just calming her sensory system down. So we knew some things and were a little different. Her pediatrician definitely had concerns about her not responding to her name. We gave her a little time because, of course, as a first-time parent, we didn't 100% know, what the signs were that were kind of we need to get on this. And so we really trusted our pediatrician that we had at the time, and she pushed us to get her an evaluation through early intervention. So when we went through that process, she was about 2 years old, and it took, a few months to sort of do all the evaluations and get everybody on board before we started having people kind of come out to the house and working with her. At that time, she received occupational therapy. So at about 2.5, she was still only using one word at a time, and it would be very labored for her to get a word out most of the time. During her development, so from the time she was a baby up until this point, we had noticed things where she would try to talk, and I had no words to describe what I was watching at the time because I had never seen it before, but we came to find out that she was apraxic, and so she would have extreme verbal groping where she'd be straining and trying to push words out of her throat. And that was very concerning when I started seeing my baby doing that because it definitely just hit me that something was not right. Yeah. And I had never witnessed another person try to speak in that way. When we were at the point where we were receiving services through Sooner Start, she would work with her occupational therapist. And at that time, what I believe had happened, is that she was attempting to communicate with us through the years, through, her first 2 years. And then we didn't know it because a lot of the noises that she was making, I believe to her was communication, and to us it was just jargon, and it was wild sounds, and it didn't make any sense. So you didn't always know to acknowledge or to do what you would naturally do with a child that you could, somewhat understand their approximations. Her approximations in the beginning were almost completely, unidentifiable of what they were. And so it just sort of sounded like a baby kind of talking to herself and making silly noises.
Yeah.
And so I think she got to the point where she did not view adults or other people as sources of help.
Mm-hmm.
If anything, we were just like kind of giants and monsters in her world, getting between her and things that she wanted and needed. So she sort of developed this just like hyper independence where in her mind, if she needed something, she had to go get it herself. She had to figure out, if something's up on the high shelf, like how do I get something to climb on to go up there and get it myself, instead of the natural development where a child just will sort of come and get the caregiver and point or grunt, at a thing that they want and get help that way. So that became a fun challenge to sort of retrain. And that was the first thing that occupational therapy worked with her on, was sort of just like sabotaging her on things that like playing games and, say we'd put something like a piece of candy in a box and put the top on it where she definitely couldn't get the top off, and wait and force her to have to ask us to open it. And at that point we were just she was completely nonverbal, and she would vocalize, but it was not intelligible at that point. So we were teaching her like symbolic gestures, so tapping on something twice to say open, and we would model it for her, open, and tap on it, and then just wait until she was so completely frustrated. We would try to hand over hand with her. She was so independent. She hated hand over hand. Oh my goodness. She still does hate hand over hand assistance. But that was literally her first step. At the same time, she's highly, highly intelligent. So once she realized the thing that she had to do and that there was no option to get around it, okay, she couldn't get the jar open by herself. She would struggle with it and get angry and get frustrated. And then she would just walk away.
Yeah.
And we would take the jar and look at her again and tap on it. And, do you want it open? Open. And show her. And try to take her hand. And a lot of times she'd scream and pull it away. And finally, she taps on it. And she's like, oh, yeah. And there was a massive win for us to teach her just that symbolism of tapping twice to get it open. And, of course, she got her, I think it was a Tootsie Roll at the time.
Yeah.
And so then we kept practicing with that. And over the week, I mean, she picks up things so quickly. And she has since she was a baby. So once she was like, oh, well, that's how I get what I want, she's like, on board. Okay, so she was tapping it constantly. And I think I fed her so many Tootsie Rolls that week, she got incredibly ill. So and the next week, I was standing at my counter for like half an hour chopping Tootsie Rolls into tiny pieces so that when she would tap on it, she would only get a small piece for the next week and not get sick.
And I'm sure she noticed that immediately whenever you cut them smaller than they had been.
No, she didn't really mind, honestly. It was such a positive reinforcement for her, but it was a good moment. It was kind of our first win of sort of bringing her back to us.
Yeah. I heard you say quite a few terms we use in the SLP world. So is that just some things you picked up because you've been around the block for so long? Or can you explain a little bit about your background?
Yes. My background is in business and accounting. And at this point, I'm an entrepreneur, and we own several businesses. I do not have any background in speech or therapy. So it was just sort of a learning opportunity at the point at which, you realize something's going on with your child. I kind of just dove in and learned.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot that even people that I've worked with, like our professionals, just they didn't know. And it's sort of more just my personality to kind of just jump in and research and get to the bottom of whatever I can. When I went back to work, I was gone. I worked a lot of hours a week. So my husband would be at home with her until she was about 18 months old. And one of our businesses really was picking up at that time, and he needed to be gone during the day, because at that point we would sort of trade off. I would be gone during the the morning until the evening. I'd bring work home. She was a baby. I call them like little love lumps when they're that age. They're not doing a whole lot except being fed and cuddled. And so I'd work at night at home, and then he would go and do what he needed to do. And we got to the point where he really needed to be gone during the day. So we searched out daycare for her. At this point, she was not developing in her speech at a rate that would be considered typical. She would attempt words. Like I was saying, she would have the verbal groping where she would strain so hard to just get, sounds to come out of her neck. You'd see her veins bulging in her neck and her forehead, and she'd turn red and she'd be shaking because she'd be straining so hard to just say, eat.
Yeah.
And she wouldn't even get eat out. It'd be et. And
Yeah.
it was like this very strained experience. But she had no hesitation in doing it. So at that time, when she was, up to about 18 months old, she was still attempting to speak and communicate and connect. And we saw no real symptoms of autism at that point, as far as what would develop shortly thereafter. So when we put her in daycare, we made the wrong choice. And the daycare was not a good fit for her. She ended up having a sort of extreme negative experience there. She, on her last day there, was very ill. And come to find out, at this point, I was 6 months pregnant with my second child. And she had developed pneumonia. And it was a very traumatic experience for her. I think, number one, becoming that ill. She stopped talking that day when I picked her up from daycare. She was very weak. I got her to the doctor. The doctor had to do an x-ray, which I did not expect. And being pregnant, I couldn't go in with her. And so that chest x-ray was very traumatic for her. I don't know if you're familiar with they put them in like a little tube and kind of strap them in. And she was not on board with that experience.
Was scared.
And she was terrified. And of course, basically, Mommy brought me in this room while I'm ill. They strapped me in this thing, and then I walked out of the room because I couldn't be there, seeing as how I was pregnant. And they took the x-rays. She had pneumonia. Obviously, it was necessary. We gave her medication. She improved as far as her physical health went. But sort of coupled with the negative experience at the daycare and that illness, there were a couple other things going on. We bought a new house because we were expanding our family. We needed some more space, which she loved. She was very happy about. But there was a lot of change sort of in this very short period of time. And it was sort of the event that kicked off her sort of just disappearing as a person. She withdrew. It was a little bit of a slow fade. So I just started noticing her stop making eye contact. Or, you'd be holding her and you'd sort of look at her over your shoulder and she'd turn her head down or try to hide behind her hair. And we just saw her personality get smaller. I would just say like smaller and quieter and much more internal. And you would have to work a lot harder to get her to connect with you just as a person, just to make the eye contact. We stopped seeing her smile as much. I mean, it was almost like you just watched her little light just kind of dim down and she just went inside of herself. And so at that point we knew, like, we have to get her help. Like, something is definitely not right here. She's physically healthy. At this point, life was fine. We had a baby. She was fine with the new baby. She didn't interact with the new baby. The new baby terrified her.
Yeah.
But other than that, everything was okay in her world. But we just we just kept seeing her sort of disappearing. And at that point, it became apparent to me that I had a choice of sort of letting her disappear into wherever she was going, or I was going to have to fight to get her to come back. And that was what I felt inside of myself as a mother, is that this became my personal fight. To fight for her to have a happy life, to come back and know that she was safe here with us, that she could come back out of her little shell, that the world was not going to be, scary and terrifying forever, and that she was safe. And, that was sort of where I went, starting to research things, starting to get ideas of how to work with her, and sort of just slowly, it was like pulling a thread, like really slowly just starting to get her to kind of come back. And I mean, now, working with her, she's full of personality
Oh, full
and
of
opinions.
personality.
And she's not afraid to connect at all.
No.
But it's a miracle if you knew where she started and then where she went and then where she is now has been just a massive journey.
Yeah, and I'm just going to add this in here. When she started at the Mary Kay Chapman Center, she was first nonverbal, correct?
She was completely nonverbal. I mean, I say she's completely nonverbal as far as she could still intermittently, she would still say mama.
Yeah.
So not completely, but it would be more of an approximation.
Mm-hmm.
She had, words she might attempt. But like I said, when she got here at Mary Kay Chapman, she was shut down.
Yeah.
So the progress that we saw in the beginning with just her sort of fighting against the fact that her mouth didn't do what she wanted it to do, the apraxia, was a different game than what happened when she withdrew and you really saw these autism symptoms. And I took her quite a few places to get evaluations. So we worked with early intervention. They provided the occupational therapist. She still wasn't talking. She's like 2.5. And I'm like, you have to give her a speech therapist.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we have to get some sort of speech going.
Mm-hmm.
Because she learned to tap on everything to open. And that became her one symbolic gesture. So then at this point, she started slapping everybody. She wanted something because this was the one thing she had. And we really pushed on her, to start working on speech at that time. We had evaluations done, medically. So within, the doctor's office, like psychology.
Yeah.
Right. We had a private psychologist, clinical psychologist, do an evaluation because I just felt like she was very invested and very good.
Yeah.
And she was very helpful at the time. We had some other people do evaluations. I will tell you, as far as evaluations go, I definitely don't put much weight on them anymore, as I did in the beginning, where it's just a point in time. The way we look at it now is it's just a picture of what a test looks like today at a point in time. And the test isn't actually always reflective of reality, which was really helpful that private clinical psychologist told me. She said, I'm going to do this evaluation. We did some IQ testing. And she looked at me and she said, it's going to come back wrong. She said, I'm going to do the test exactly like the test needs to be done, because she needed the test for some other things. She said, but I don't want you to get down because I'm looking at her and it's not going to reflect her potential.
Yeah, and being one of her clinicians, she is extremely intelligent. Sometimes we just have to go around the way that the question might be asked on the test. We have to find different words to use or different ways to ask her, but she is extremely intelligent. I was just telling someone, I was asking her to tell me a word that means the same thing as accident, and she's kind of looking at me, and then Catherine says, tell her what a synonym is for accident, and she's like, oh, a mistake. Like, she's so intelligent.
Yes, she's very intelligent, and she's almost comically has such a massive vocabulary at this point, considering people's expectations of her at the beginning, and even sometimes now. I mean, she's verbal, right? But she doesn't speak in complete sentences still. She's still learning. She's still, working on her skills. And, I kind of equate her speech to like broken English at this point. If you want to understand what she's saying, you can work at it and you can listen and you can understand. If you don't want to understand what she's saying, then it might not make sense.
Yeah.
Right? The sentences that she uses, you're like, well, I don't know what that meant, or it didn't mean anything. It wasn't, it wasn't applicable to the situation. But if you actually stop and think about what she said or what she saw, or, some other clue, there's probably a clue missing, and you can kind of bridge that gap, and it makes a lot of sense. And you can really connect with her and sort of have a conversation, but it's a little bit different, right? It's not your typical conversation. What I will say, though, is that I did learn a lot through her evaluations. Some of the evaluations I cried when I read them. Some of the wording that the professionals used were, in my opinion, inappropriate. It was derogatory towards her as a person, towards her potential, things that I didn't feel like were objective but were subjective, statements about her that was crushing at the time, because I'm just a mom and I love my kids, however they come. and you want the world to see them the way that you see them.
Yeah.
You want the world to see the light and the potential and the intelligence, and that she's funny and that she's fun, that she adds to the world, and that she has the ability to do so much. And to see a professional on top of it, to say certain things that were said in some of her reports. I mean, it was heartbreaking. And so I got a clue pretty quickly through some of the evaluations and through other experiences with other professionals in the field and in related fields with her, that if I wanted to give her the best chance of reaching her potential, that I had to help her do it. That as a mother, you are the most invested. As a father, my husband's very involved. As a parent, I guess, you're the most invested. You love your child. You study your child. In my case, I'm with her basically 24/7, which some days...
Catherine's a super mom.
which some days adds up. But she sort of, at that time, your first child, and my second one was, like I said, a little love lump still. She was just being cuddled and swaddled when we were just starting to go on this journey. And so I did kind of dive into the research. I would read articles on PubMed and just anything I could get my hands on. Just what is factual. I don't want someone's opinion. I want to know, what are we dealing with? What's the best way to help? Kind of where is she at on this spectrum, even with like apraxia, not just the autism spectrum, right? But like on a speech spectrum, where are we at? What does she understand? What does she not understand? What's the next kind of like micro step that I can take to just get her one more thing, to get her one tiny bit closer to then the next step and the next step? Because that's really where we're at. We had a kid that slid back to 0. When she shut down on us, there was no speaking, none.
Yeah.
And she would gutturally grunt. It was like very primal. It was a little scary sometimes. It was like, where did my kid go? She would grunt at us. And a lot of what I learned through that was to start with her sensory needs. And so I got her all sorts of things to sort of help to regulate. So I would just watch. When was she dysregulated? Just watching her. And she really liked Play-Doh. We would call it her squishy. And sometimes she would just be acting out because she was having a full meltdown. And I would have to, we had like a little spot in the house that sort of became a safe spot for her. And when she'd have a meltdown, sometimes you'd see her over there when she was struggling, and she'd kind of just like back herself into this little spot and she'd cry or whatever. And I would try to connect with her. Sometimes you just had to give her a minute. I mean, everybody's like that, right? Sometimes we just need a minute to sort of bring the level down before we can even hear the noise of what's going on to regulate. And I learned that the Play-Doh helped her immensely, just that tactile experience. Sometimes she would be having a meltdown in her little spot, and I would even come over and say, get your squishy, and she'd be sobbing or screaming, and I would just take her hand, and I would stick the Play-Doh in it, and then I would take her hand and mush the Play-Doh with her hand, and she'd slowly start doing it herself, and I could just take my hands off. And then she'd sit there, and then you'd just watch her. She'd go from like full meltdown, sobbing and screaming, to like it would just get a little quieter. And then she'd be rolling it on the tile, and then she'd be pushing it really hard, and you'd just see the level, and she'd kind of come back into herself. And then at that point, I would attempt to communicate with her about whatever the issue was. But it was very consistent that it was always starting with the sensory issues.
Yeah.
So, when she's dysregulated, we can expect nothing. And that's the same for everyone. It's the same for myself as an adult. If I'm highly dysregulated, you're probably not going to get very far with me. So that sort of became a baseline with everything that we did with her, with everything I did with her, to just sort of, let's get regulated. Let's have the sensory experience. Sometimes it was just having the sensory experience. She would be like seeking.
Yeah.
Your kid's out of control. Why? Well, she's seeking. She needs a sensory input. So we came up with all sorts of stuff. I mean, I would put soapy water in the kitchen, let her bathe her toys, because she wanted the water. She loved the water feeling, and so she'd have her hands in the soap and the water and all that. I would, of course, give her Play-Doh. We had so much Play-Doh. Slime. We made slime constantly and put different textures in it and stuff like that. At one point, we had an extra mattress in our living room, and it lived there for a couple years. We called it couch bed because she jumped. She would get excited, and she'd run, and then she'd want to jump, and she'd just sit there on that mattress and just jump and jump and jump and jump and jump. And we had some like negative sensory behaviors that we saw. She would self-harm by scratching herself. She had like a sore that developed that took us like 2.5 years to get healed. It was terrifying. She hated having to put medication on it, but we would just see that. Like, we'd see her get anxious, she'd start scratching. We'd see her get upset, and she'd run into the wall sometimes when she'd be seeking. Another one she used to think was funny was she would sit herself on the edge of the couch and basically base jump. She would just fall over with her arms and her legs splayed out onto the floor. And I have a concrete foundation, so it was terrifying. So that was why we started getting her some positive sensory experiences.
Yeah.
Like the mattress to jump on and
Yeah.
all the other things. And of course, things to chew on, because she was a mouther. But that became the baseline of, let's get the sensory stuff out of the way, and then we can start working on communicating. And, at this point, now we're educating, right? We're beyond the beginnings of the communication.
Yeah, she is highly intelligent. We're working on questions right now, and she can ask some questions. You might not know what she's going to ask, but she can ask them.
I know. We're working on appropriate questions.
So, what are some misconceptions about her diagnosis that you wish other people would know right from the bat?
Well, as far as apraxia went, in the beginning, we would see her with the pop words, right? So we have a kid that's almost completely nonverbal, and because she's autistic and withdrawn at that point, she was almost non-interactive. But at the same time, like, for example, we were at a restaurant, and we were kind of wrapping up, and a lady was leaving, and she walked past the table, and she kind of just looked at us, and she goes, "Oh, she is so cute." And Annabelle looks up, looks the lady dead in the face, and goes, "Thank you," and goes right back to it. And me and my husband couldn't speak. We didn't even know she knew what those words were.
Yeah.
Thank you. Like, what does that even? We didn't even know she knew what that meant.
Yeah.
Much less that she was capable of saying it, right? And we had experiences like that, obviously highly intermittently, but randomly, and it became more complex words, but they would come out and they would be clear as day. They'd be used appropriately. And it was completely shocking, because most people would have met a completely silent, withdrawn child that was, around 3 years old. And they always assumed that, number one, she was never listening, which was incorrect. That child is always listening. And
She's always listening.
Yeah. And number two, that she didn't understand, which was also very incorrect. She has a lot of personality, and she's very good at pretending, which is what I always warn her therapists. Say, you might think I'm mean, but I'm really not. She knows exactly what you're asking her to do. She will pretend she does not. And if she catches you and you give in, she will carry on as long as she possibly can to just sort of do what she wants instead of what you're asking her to do. So you have to assume competence.
Yeah, she's sneaky. She's sneaky. There's a mirror, and she always insists that the therapist sit with their back to that mirror. And while we're asking her questions on the book, she's looking in that mirror trying to figure out the answer. She is sneaky.
She's funny. She's always been that way.
She's so funny.
So I would say people assume incompetence, and that's definitely not accurate. I mean, there's definitely been times where even like clinicians that we've worked with, they start talking and start saying things, and I'm like, I've had to stop them and say, like, we can't have this discussion with her sitting here. And they kind of looked at me like I'm crazy. And I'm like, no, she's listening. And if you watch her, you have to look for these like micro clues with her, even from when she was little. She would crouch down. She'd have her back to you. She'd be vocally stimming. So she'd be making all her little noises. But she'd have the corner of her eye. She'd be looking at you out of the corner of her eye, sort of like with her head kind of barely turned. And she'd be very still with her body. And I'm like, she's listening to everything you're saying.
Yeah.
And now she does the same thing, but we see it a lot faster. We see sort of like that I was right.
Yep.
And she was listening
Yep.
a lot faster, because me and my husband might be in a totally different room and talking about something, and she'll hear one word, and then say 5-10 minutes later, she's asking a question about that subject.
Yeah.
No, what's this? Or when are we going to do this? And it's like, well, you weren't invited to that conversation for a reason.
She has ears everywhere.
She has ears everywhere. And she understands and I believe is pretty common with apraxic kids. They understand so much more than they can say. And because of that, I think she's highly underestimated. And a lot of kids are. They're highly underestimated. I think you can use assessments and labels as tools. I think it's helpful to have a diagnosis, I have a lot of people that ask me, like, oh, well, I was afraid to get her diagnosed at the beginning. Like, I was terrified to have autism, as a label on her. And then I just realized it doesn't matter. If anything, it's just a descriptive, right?
Mhm.
It's a description of what we're experiencing at the time. Same thing with the evaluations, right?
Mhm.
It's just a description of what we see at a point in time. It's not it's not the potential
exactly.
that you're looking at. It's just today. And so I think it's helpful to have the diagnosis. It allows her to access services. It allows people to somewhat understand. I don't think that it's fully understand how unique autistic kids are.
Yeah. I firmly believe that if you guys would have taken that diagnosis, what it said, and let that limit you, that she would still be nonverbal.
Oh, I agree. I mean, it was such a challenge. Like I said, it was a miracle to get her to sort of just come back to us.
Mhm.
And that was what I was wanting. I just wanted her to come back. And
Yeah.
if anything, as a mother, I mean, somewhat selfishly, like I missed my child.
Yeah.
I wanted this child so badly, and I finally had her, and then she disappeared. It was crushing.
Mhm.
And then it felt like, because partially it was due to some of our choices, right? We chose the daycare she went into. It was the wrong choice. And you feel responsible that I broke my kid. And
You didn't break your kid.
well, we know that now.
Yeah.
I unbroke her maybe a little bit. We have tape and glue.
But
But
she's an awesome kid.
that's what it felt like in the moment.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It was so scary. When you're on the front side of those diagnoses, all you have at that point is what you've seen in the past, what you've heard people talk about sort of anecdotally about maybe somebody else's kids that and what their potential was, and what your clinician's telling you. And we hadn't seen any of the skills that would develop in the future at that point. And so it was like a journey of faith.
Mhm.
I would talk to her, and I had to just have faith that she understood. And it's hard sometimes, especially when you're there and you're with your kid by yourself, especially with the first child. And maybe it was just me. It was super awkward. I'm talking to a kid that won't look at me, that doesn't acknowledge me, and I'm supposed to just keep having a conversation with her. It was like talking to the wall. It was weird.
Yeah.
And sometimes I felt crazy because clinicians would somewhat, they're kind of placating you as a mother sometimes. You get the vibe. I'm like, I think she understands more than she's letting on. They're like, sure. Let's keep working on this, though. And I'm like, and we would start to just see small glimpses. It was just the one-off pop words that she had this ability to speak, and it was still in there. It was moments where I would call her bluff. There were a couple of moments when she was very small, when she was about 3, and she was being naughty. And she kept touching something, and I kept telling her, no, no touch. I think that's what I used to tell her, no touch. And I'd kind of tap her finger, no touch. And she was persistent, and she wouldn't look up at me. She wouldn't make eye contact. And she just acts like she doesn't even hear you. And I got a little frustrated. And I looked at her, and it was just me and her at the house. And of course, she's not making eye contact with me at all. So I just looked at her, and I said, I know you hear me, and I know you know what I'm saying to you. I know you understand me. And I said, no. And when I said, I know you know what I'm saying, she froze her whole body and snapped her head up at me and made eye contact with me, which was very rare at that point in time, and looked very afraid in the face. And at that point, I was about 50% bluffing myself. And with her reaction, it shocked me so much that I had a reaction on my face. And when she saw me react, she snapped her head back down and turned away and started ignoring me again. But she didn't touch the thing that I was telling her not to touch anymore. And I remember telling my husband, she understands.
Yeah.
Like, she's there.
Yeah.
We just have to make her world safe.
Yep.
So that she can come back out.
Yeah.
But that was just moments like that where it was like a faith journey, because you're just doing all these things and you see no payoff for so long. We would say words and she would never even approximate them. I taught her sign language, for a long time. It was a struggle before she could actually, because she has global apraxia as well, that she could even get her hands to do what she wanted.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes she would look at her hands and grunt when she
Yeah.
was trying to sign things. And so it was a journey of faith in the beginning. And where we're at now, it's easier emotionally because we have so many like positive experiences sort of in that win column.
Yeah.
I know for a fact that if I just keep doing the thing, we're going to make progress.
Yeah.
It's just more of like me finding the right tool to use to sort of like help her get to the next
Mhm.
level. But if we just keep at it, we're going to see progress.
Yeah.
Right.
SLPs only see the kid usually twice a week, maybe an hour. Like, a lot of the progress that you're going to see is buy-in and from the parents, and you guys have definitely bought all the way in. Nobody should give you a limit on what your child can do. And if you push and push and push, you'll see progress. And I feel like that's what you guys have done.
Well, thank you. I mean, that goes for everyone, though, right?
Yeah, for
It's
everybody.
not just your child. It's just not the kids that have, a disability. It's everyone. We're all unlimited. I think we kind of take that for granted. But I do think it's very important for clinicians to be very careful about the words that they give to parents, because there were definitely times that I was emotionally beat down, that I was, somewhat grieved for her future. And you can call it whatever it was, but it sort of just came over me that it didn't matter.
Yeah.
It didn't matter what people thought.
Yeah.
It didn't matter what people saw.
Mhm.
That she was going to do whatever she wanted to do. And I was going to be there to give her the opportunity.
Yep.
And so that's sort of just how we live our life.
Yeah. Well, sadly, we're about out of time, so I've just got one more question for you.
Okay.
How has the Mary Kay Chapman Center made an impact on you and your family?
The center has made a massive impact on our family. We originally received services for our daughter through early intervention. We've been in private therapy. We've been in a hospital setting. We've come here. And the therapy that she's received at the Chapman Center has by far, at this point, that's all we do, because it is by far the best fit for her. The hardest thing for her is that, her clinicians grow up and move on to the next phase of life.
Yeah.
And she doesn't get to be part of that. And that's still something that we work with, right? That, you learn, you grow, and they move on, and she meets a new friend, and
Yeah.
then they have the next step of the journey, which has been interesting at this point to watch, because each clinician she's had has really stepped through a different part of her journey, a different part of her development.
Yeah.
Her first clinicians, we would be in one room, and it was just trying to get her to play with a toy.
Yeah.
Right? Or make one single approximation. And then that person rolled off, and you got the next one. And the next one was trying to get her to interact with people, and would set up fun games for her downstairs. And she would play with toys, but include the students who were not her direct clinicians, which she absolutely adored. And then, we've had clinicians that following directions was really sort of the core of what we were doing. And we did a lot of crafts as some of those activities of getting her to follow step-by-step directions and sort of buy into a process. And then, where we're at now, where we're looking more at communication in full language and asking questions, right?
Yeah.
We're making inferences.
Yeah.
We're studying vocabulary words and sort of pushing her to cooperate with exactly what's asked, which is the struggle sometimes. But we see the progress. And the thing that's so nice about the Chapman Center is because she's been here, and everyone's just so kind. They love my child. They care about my child. Other places we were at, she was just like a number and a cattle call. And you saw it in her body. Like, we would go to pull up, and she didn't want to get out of the car. There were places, at one point when she was a toddler, she tried to crawl under the car in a parking lot. And I had a newborn in a baby carrier, and I was trying to drag her out from under the car.
Yeah.
So it's like, it can be bad when it's not a good fit. But at the Chapman Center, everyone loves her. She's excited to come. She is treated like family. And I think we see the fruits of that in the relationships that she builds, with the clinicians, with the staff. And it feels like people are invested in her development and in her progress. And when we have a win, I feel like everybody celebrates together.
Yep.
And when we have struggles, I feel like everybody kind of feels it.
Mm-hmm.
There's things that are hard for her.
Mm-hmm.
And see, she lost her first tooth. And that was emotionally distressing for her. And I knew it was going to be. It was getting wiggly. I was prepping her. It's going to come out. It's going to happen. It's going to be okay. You just have to bring it to mommy. And she would tell me, no, it's not coming out. And we had this conversation for quite a while because thank God it was wiggly for close to a month. So she sort of had a little bit of runway to emotionally adjust. But when it came out, it just so happened that it was the morning before we were leaving to come to therapy. And, in her world, it was terrifying. It was distressing. Like her body's basically doing something that she wasn't allowing it to do. And she was very dysregulated. She was having a full meltdown. And I remember calling her therapist. Well, I think I texted her therapist and said, hey, this is what's going on. And one of the staff members called me back. And they said, she doesn't have to come. It's okay. I said, no. She needs to know that this isn't a big deal, that we can just move on with our life. It's going to be fine. She's going to lose more, and it can't be such a big deal that she, has to take a day off every time a tooth falls out. By the time, that was literally when we were getting ready to walk out of the house. So say 30, 40 minutes later, we're at the Chapman Center, and we pull up, and she still didn't want to come in. She was still upset, and I kept telling her, it's going to be okay. We're going to have a good day. Let's go in. We're going to do therapy. We're going to do what we always do. We're going to do our routine. And we walk in, and her therapist is standing there with a certificate of achievement with her name written on it for losing her first tooth. And at that moment, her entire world changed.
Yeah.
She was so happy and proud of herself. Yeah. And she was literally beaming. And that little piece of paper that had just been printed off with her name written on it and nothing else became her most prized award. Yeah. And we still to this day have it hanging up in our house. And she will go and look at it, and she'll tell me that that's mine.
Oh,
I lost my first tooth. Yes. So the small things that we've experienced here have just made the biggest difference.
Yeah.
And I think we have to remember that as much as we want kids to improve, we want them to hit the milestones. We want them to do all the things, but they're people.
Yep.
These are just little people, little hearts and souls that we hold in our hands. And just like the smallest acts of kindness can make such a difference.
Yeah, I agree.
And that's what we experience here.
Yeah. I'm so thankful to be a part of you guys' journey. And it's been so fun to see her grow because I've been her clinician for about a year now. And there's just been so much progress. I remember hearing about the Tooth Award story. Was that Miss Faith?
Yes.
We love you, Miss Faith.
Yes, we do. We miss you.
And I know she's one of the Mary Kay Chapman Center loves her so much. And we're just so happy you guys have chosen to be a part of our clinic. And I'm super thankful to know you guys.
Yes, I just want to say thank you, Catherine, for coming in and talking with us today. And of course, to Dayli, too, our graduate student. It's a pleasure to hear from a parent themselves. I think we can often get stuck in the books and just hearing all the stats and information, but it means so much more to hear from the experiences of parents and our children or our different clients and what they experience through life. So it's been really meaningful to hear from you today.
Thank you.
For further information or podcast ideas that you'd like to share with us, please reach out at 918-631-2504. You can ask for Chloe or Sarah. We would be happy to chat with you.
Thank you, Studio 151, for letting us record. We look forward to recording future podcasts.
Remember, communication is not just about words. It's about understanding, empathy, and connection. Until next time, keep listening, keep learning, and keep communicating.